Greetings to the good folks in Franklin. I am so happy to be with you again this week, and I was grateful to hear from Deacon Dave that the technology worked fine last week. We are all learning so much during this time. This Sunday, we have our final reading in a long series of epistle readings from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, to the church at Rome. He wrote this letter in advance of the visit that he made there, the capital of the empire. Of course, he would want to go there sometime, and so he wrote this rather long letter laying out his views, his theology, and applying it to their situation in Rome. It comes to its pinnacle, I believe, in Romans chapter 8, which we heard from earlier in the summer, when Paul writes that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. And having worked his way to that mountain peak, as it were, he then spends the rest of the letter applying it to various situations in their church, and sometimes it speaks very much to ours. And so, for instance, last week we heard another key core principle from this letter to the Romans when Paul wrote that all of the commandments, all of them, come down to this: love your neighbor as yourself. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Love your neighbor as yourself. You can build a life just on those two principles. And the reading that we have for this Sunday is as meaningful and alive today as it was in that day. It begins with these words. Paul writes, "Welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions." Now, you may have experienced quarreling in the church. Maybe you've never experienced any quarreling in the church. I have heard that it does happen. What was causing the quarreling amongst the Christians at Rome? Paul says there are those who are strong and there are those who are weak in their faith. It may be that with Rome as the capital of the empire and the Christian faith as a relatively new thing, that there were Jewish Christians in Rome and there were Gentile Christians in Rome, and people who had been coming there from different parts of the world, and they had their different ways in the way they understood and practiced the faith. It may be that there were Jewish Christians who felt strongly that they should maintain all of their customs and traditions that they had learned before. There may have been other Jewish Christians who felt that now, because of their faith in Jesus, they were free to not necessarily follow all of those practices, and maybe they were arguing about which ones they had to keep or how they might be modified. There were undoubtedly Gentile Christians who had no background in any of these Jewish customs and practices and didn't believe that they had to follow them at all. And then there may have been Gentile Christians who were excited to be sort of grafted into this heritage and wanted to adopt a lot of Jewish practices and thought that that was extremely important. So you can see that there would be many ways that people could get involved in quarreling amongst the Christians in Rome over these sorts of things, the strong and the weak. And Paul points out that some of the arguments were about what food you should eat and what food you shouldn't eat, and what days you should observe in your religion and what days that you should not observe. Probably the strong means those who had a kind of faith in Jesus that made them be able to sit more lightly to these customs and practices and feel that they weren't absolutely required. And the weak in faith felt more that they had to do some of these things in order to be right with God. Nonetheless, they were quarreling. Now, I think about some of the things that we could quarrel about in the church, and we could make a long list, but a few of them might be in terms of worship practices. Are we more high church? Are we more low church? Do we think it's important to make the sign of the cross, or do we think it's important to never make the sign of the cross? And how do we look at other people who do some of those practices, bowing at certain times or saying certain prayers, and people who don't? Probably there's more quarreling in our day about style of worship, whether it should be more traditional in style or more contemporary in style, and especially when it comes to music. We're experiencing stress and quarreling in the church today around all of the issues of reopening our churches and what we should do and when we should do it and how it should be done. And so I know of congregations where there are serious disagreements going on about how to reopen the church, when to open it, whether it should be done at all, how soon it should be done, whether people should have to wear masks, whether singing is okay now or not, who has the ability to make these decisions. And all of that, of course, moves right into the difficult and stressful politics of our day that we are living with. If we go back to Paul and what he's saying in this part of the letter to the Romans, he makes it very clear that he has his own views, and he says what they are. He is among those who believe that his faith in Jesus, his strong faith in Jesus, allows him to have some freedom about what to eat or not to eat, for instance. But he also makes it clear that having that strong kind of faith requires him and allows him to respect those who don't. And he calls the Roman Christians to respect each other, even in their differences, to tolerate each other, even to go further than toleration, because he says the strong should defer to the weak. I thought there was a great example of this today in the bulletin for the outdoor service in Franklin. Let me just read the part that impressed me as being right in the spirit that Paul's talking about. It says, reminders for safety in gathering. We have a mic for radio broadcast in your car and outside amplification. We understand that you each must make a choice in regards to your own health and that of others of whether you remain in your car or sit on a lawn chair, wear a mask or not. But please respect other people's choices and needs. Now, Paul's words about not quarreling over opinions about food and observance of particular days and his call to people to respect each other and tolerate each other in their differences and for the strong to defer to the conscience of the weak, those are all words to the church. Now, we know we have terrible stress and tension and division in our society today. Paul's words were first for the church. And we can begin there. Statements like the one in the bulletin that I read are a good example of what we can do in the church. And I believe that when we start to live that way there, even a little bit, it has an impact beyond the boundaries of the church. Because it means that somewhere in this world, and somewhere even in this difficult, stressful, divisive, tense world that we're living in now, there are some people who are trying to reflect in their lives what the psalm we heard today says about God. Full of compassion and mercy, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Greetings to the good folks in Franklin. I'm happy to be with you again this week, and I was glad to hear from Deacon Dave that the technology worked fine last week. We are all learning so much during this time. This Sunday, we have our final reading in a long series of epistle readings from Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul wrote this letter to the church in Rome. He had not been there. It was later in his career, and he wanted to sort of prepare them for the visit that he hoped to make, and he did get to make. We also know from this letter that he was hoping to go on from Rome to Spain, and that probably never happened. We know he was martyred in Rome, and if he did get to Spain and back to Rome, there's absolutely no record of it. But